A judge was about to sentence an innocent man, but a K9's action changed everything. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Samuel Hargrove adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. The case before him had been highly publicized. A young man accused of a violent robbery, caught near the crime scene with no alibi. The prosecution had painted him as a dangerous criminal, and the jury had already seemed swayed. James Calloway, the defense attorney, glanced at his client, David Morales, who sat stiffly beside him. David's hands were clenched together, his jaw tight. He had maintained his innocence from the beginning, but as the trial had progressed, it became clear that the weight of the system was stacked against him. The prosecution had presented circumstantial evidence: a ski mask found near the scene, an eyewitness who claimed they saw someone who looked like David, and the fact that he had been in the area. James had done his best to tear down the weak foundations of their case, but it felt like speaking into a void. The courtroom had already decided that a young man from the wrong side of town had to be guilty. Judge Hargrove cleared his throat and prepared to speak. The jury had reached a verdict. A hush fell over the room. Before the judge could utter a word, a low growl echoed through the courtroom. All eyes turned toward the defense table, where K9 Officer Titan, a highly trained police dog, had been lying silently for most of the trial. Titan had been present throughout the proceedings as part of security detail, his handler, Officer Bradley, standing beside him. But now, for the first time, the Belgian Malinois was alert. His eyes locked onto the prosecutor. The growl grew louder. The prosecutor, Charles Winters, shifted in his seat. "Control that dog," he snapped, glaring at Officer Bradley. But Bradley wasn't moving. Titan's stance had changed. His ears were pinned back, his fur bristling. Something about the man in front of him had set him off. Judge Hargrove frowned. "Officer Bradley, is there something wrong with your K9? The officer hesitated. "Your Honor, Titan is an expert in scent detection. He has been trained to alert when he senses something suspicious." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Titan took a step forward, his nose twitching, his posture rigid. Then, in a swift motion, he lunged toward the prosecutor's briefcase. Gasps erupted as the officer moved quickly, restraining the dog before he could latch on. But Titan wasn't acting out of aggression. His nose pressed against the side of the briefcase, and then he looked up at his handler, barking twice. A signal. Officer Bradley's face went pale. Titan had just alerted to something inside the prosecutor's belongings. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Winters, open your briefcase." The prosecutor's face flushed. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Open it. Now." With trembling hands, Winters unlatched the briefcase and flipped it open. The moment he did, several sheets of paper spilled onto the table. Documents. But not just any documents, case files, witness statements, and something that made James Calloway's blood run cold. A letter from a key witness stating that they had been coerced into identifying David Morales as the suspect. The courtroom erupted. James lunged forward, snatching the paper, his eyes scanning it in disbelief. It was signed and dated, proof that the prosecution had hidden exculpatory evidence. David Morales, accused of a crime he didn't commit, had nearly been sent to prison. And the only reason they found out? Titan. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" Titan barked again, standing firm beside his handler. The entire room had shifted. David wasn't just fighting to prove his innocence anymore. Now, the real question was, who was guilty? The courtroom descended into chaos. People whispered furiously, some gasping in disbelief, others muttering about corruption. Judge Hargrove banged his gavel repeatedly, his face dark with anger. "Order! I will have order in this court." Titan stood firm, his body still tense, eyes locked onto the prosecutor. Officer Bradley kept a tight grip on the K9's leash, but he didn't pull him back. There was no mistake. Titan had detected something wrong. James Calloway gripped the witness statement tightly, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "Your Honor, this document proves that Mr. Winters withheld exculpatory evidence. Evidence that could have exonerated my client from the beginning. This is a direct violation of the law." The prosecutor, Charles Winters, had gone pale. He looked down at the exposed papers, his hands trembling as he rushed to gather them up. This is a mistake," he stammered. "This document. This was never meant to—" Judge Hargrove's sharp gaze snapped to him. "Are you saying that this wasn't supposed to be found?" Winters opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The courtroom was dead silent now, everyone watching him like a predator cornering its prey. James stepped forward, his voice steady, controlled, but burning with intensity. "Your Honor, I request an immediate review of these documents. If this letter is authentic, then not only was my client framed, but this entire case was built on a lie." Winters swallowed hard. Sweat dripped down his temple. The judge turned to Officer Bradley. "Officer, is there any reason your K9 would react this way unless he detected something significant?" Bradley shook his head. "No, Your Honor. Titan is trained to alert to the scent of distress, deception, and even trace substances. If he reacted this strongly, it means something in that briefcase is wrong." A murmur swept through the jury. James pressed forward. "Your Honor, I demand that all evidence be turned over immediately for review. We also need to investigate whether Mr. Winters has tampered with any other cases." Winters shot up from his chair. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "You think a dog's reaction is enough to throw out an entire case?" Judge Hargrove narrowed his eyes. "No, Mr. Winters, but a hidden witness statement that contradicts your entire case? That's more than enough." Winters' breathing was shallow now, his hands gripping the edges of the table as though trying to hold himself together. The judge turned to the bailiffs. "Take possession of those documents. I want a forensic team to go through every single piece of evidence used in this trial. Until then, I am placing an immediate stay on sentencing." David Morales exhaled sharply. He had been sitting frozen through the whole ordeal, his mind struggling to keep up. This couldn't be real. For the first time in months, hope flickered in his chest. The judge wasn't done. He looked directly at Winters. "Mr. Winters, you are hereby placed under investigation for prosecutorial misconduct. If you have knowingly suppressed evidence, I assure you, there will be consequences." Winters opened his mouth again, but there was nothing left to say. Titan let out another low growl, his tail rigid. It was over. The tension in the courtroom was so thick it felt like the air itself had turned solid. Judge Hargrove's gavel strike had silenced the growing whispers, but the weight of what had just transpired still loomed over everyone. A man was about to be sentenced for a crime he didn't commit, and the only reason the truth came out was because of Titan, the K9 who had sensed what human eyes had overlooked. David Morales sat in stunned silence. For months, he had told everyone he was innocent, but no one had believed him. Not the police, not the prosecutors, not even some of his own friends. But now, the truth was unraveling, and it wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about corruption. Judge Hargrove leaned forward, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Mr. Winters, based on the evidence presented, I am immediately ordering a judicial review of every case you have prosecuted in the past 5 years." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Winters, still standing behind his desk, looked like a man about to be swallowed whole. His once arrogant demeanor was gone, replaced by panic. His fingers trembled as he tried to shove the remaining papers back into his briefcase, but the sweat on his hands made them slip through his grip. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he stammered, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. "I assure you, The judge's piercing glare cut him off. "I will not tolerate perjury or the suppression of justice in my courtroom, Mr. Winters. You had a responsibility to uphold the law, and instead, it appears you have willfully ignored your duty for personal gain." Officer Bradley stepped forward, Titan still standing beside him, his ears perked and alert. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that Mr. Winters be detained while the investigation is conducted. Given the nature of the evidence, There is a real concern that he may attempt to tamper with additional files or flee. Winter's face drained of color. Detained? This is absurd. You're going to take the word of a dog over mine. Titan growled. James Calloway spoke up, his voice steady and composed. No, Mr. Winters. We're taking the word of your own hidden witness statement, the suppressed evidence, and the fact that you've just been caught trying to bury it. The dog was just the first to notice something was off. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hargrove raised his gavel once more, silencing the noise. He turned to the bailiff. Place Mr. Winters in custody. He will remain under judicial supervision while we review his conduct in this case and any others where prosecutorial misconduct may have occurred. The bailiff stepped forward. Mr. Winters, please place your hands behind your back. Winters stumbled backward. No, this isn't happening. Titan barked sharply, stepping toward him. With a heavy breath, Winters let his hands fall to his sides, resigned, and turned around as the bailiff snapped a pair of cuffs onto his wrists. A once respected prosecutor, now being led out of the courtroom like a criminal. David Morales watched the scene unfold, his pulse racing. He had spent months believing his life was over, preparing for a prison sentence he didn't deserve. But now the truth was breaking free. Judge Hargrove turned to him. Mr. Morales, given the revelations in this trial, I am ordering an immediate review of your conviction. Until this review is completed, you are released from custody, effective immediately. David's heart stopped. He was free. His mother, sitting in the back of the courtroom, burst into tears. James Calloway placed a firm hand on David's shoulder, whispering, "It's not just about winning this case, David. It's about exposing the truth." Titan let out a small, satisfied huff, settling back at Bradley's side as the judge adjourned the court. Justice had been saved, not by the system, but by a K9 who knew something was wrong before anyone else did. The sunlight felt different on David Morales' skin as he stepped outside the courthouse. For the first time in months, he wasn't being escorted in shackles. He wasn't staring at the world through the bars of a holding cell. He was free. His mother was the first to reach him, wrapping her arms around him, her body shaking from the sobs she had held in for so long. "Mijo," she whispered, gripping him tightly. I knew you didn't do it." David couldn't speak. The emotions sat heavy in his throat. James Calloway stood beside them, his phone buzzing non-stop with reporters demanding statements, advocacy groups reaching out, and legal colleagues wanting to discuss what had just happened. He had seen wrongful convictions before, but never one this close to the brink of disaster. If it hadn't been for Titan, David might have been sentenced today, and Winter's deception would have never been uncovered. Officer Bradley stood nearby, Titan sitting proudly at his side. The K9 officer had already become something of a local legend in the last few hours. Cameras flashed, news crews pressed forward, and a flurry of voices filled the space around them. "Mr. Morales, how does it feel to be free? Do you think Charles Winters intentionally tried to convict you? What are your next steps?" David swallowed hard. Just hours ago, he had been staring at a future he thought was lost. Now everyone wanted to hear from him. James cleared his throat, stepping forward. "No more questions for now. My client has just been through an unjust legal battle, one that almost cost him everything. Right now, he needs time to breathe." David looked at Titan, who was watching him intently. The dog had saved his life. With a deep breath, David finally found his voice. "I never thought I'd get to walk out of here," he said softly. "But today I did, because someone fought for me, because someone listened." He looked at Officer Bradley, then at Titan. "Because a dog knew I was innocent when no one else did." The crowd went silent, and then applause erupted. The moment was overwhelming. It wasn't just relief, it was recognition. He had spent months being called a criminal, being treated like an outcast. But now he was standing in front of the world, not as an inmate, but as a man who had survived the system trying to break him. James patted his shoulder. "Let's get you home, David. There's still work to do. But for now, just breathe." As they walked away, Titan gave one last bark, as if closing the chapter on what could have been a tragedy. But instead, it became a story about justice finally winning. Months had passed since the day David Morales walked out of that courtroom a free man, but the impact of what had happened that day still rippled across the country. His story had become a symbol of justice, of resilience, and of the dangers of a broken system. Charles Winters, once a respected prosecutor, now sat behind bars, awaiting trial for prosecutorial misconduct, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. His downfall had sent shockwaves through the legal community, prompting investigations into other cases he had handled. David wasn't the only one. The state had overturned 2 other wrongful convictions tied to Winters' office, and many more were under review. The system that had once tried to destroy David was now being forced to reckon with itself. But David wasn't just sitting back and watching. He had spent weeks meeting with legal advocates, giving interviews, speaking at panels, and telling his story. He didn't just want to move on. He wanted to make sure that no one else had to go through what he had. He had Titan to thank for that. The K9 officer had become a national hero. News stations covered his story, animal rights organizations honored him, and the police department even organized an official ceremony. That day, David stood beside Officer Bradley as Titan was given a Medal of Valor for his role in exposing the truth. The police chief shook Bradley's hand, then turned to David, his expression solemn. "We failed you," he admitted. But Titan didn't. David looked down at the Belgian Malinois, who sat proudly at Bradley's side, his tail wagging just slightly. "No," David said with a small smile. "He didn't." The crowd erupted into applause as the medal was placed around Titan's neck. For a brief moment, the dog tilted his head as if confused by all the fuss. But when he turned toward David, he licked his hand as if to say, "I knew all along." That night, as David sat at home with his mother, watching the footage of Titan receiving his medal, he finally felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. He still had a long road ahead of him, but he wasn't lost anymore. He had found his purpose, and justice for once had truly won. David sat in his small apartment, staring out the window as the city lights flickered against the dark sky. The past few months had felt like a dream, one he still wasn't sure was real. His life had gone from a nightmare inside a prison cell to standing on a stage beside Titan, watching the K9 receive a medal for saving his life. But now, reality was settling in. What came next? His phone vibrated on the table. It was James Calloway. "You ready for this?" the lawyer asked the moment David picked up. David exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, man. Talking about it again. Feels like reopening a wound that just started healing." James' voice softened. "I get it, but this isn't just about you anymore. Winters is facing trial. They're calling in everyone whose case he touched. If we can prove a pattern of misconduct, we could help a lot of people." David closed his eyes. He thought about the faces of the men he'd met while he was locked up. How many of them were innocent like him? How many never got their Titan to save them? "I'll be there," he said finally. 2 days later, David walked into a courtroom that felt eerily familiar. This time, he wasn't on trial. Winters was. The former prosecutor sat at the defense table, his once impeccable suit slightly wrinkled, his face gaunt from months of stress. The arrogance was gone. Instead, his hands fidgeted, his foot tapped anxiously against the floor. The weight of what he had done was finally catching up to him. David took a seat in the front row as the trial began. The evidence was damning. Forged documents, pressured witnesses, buried evidence. One by one, people testified, former defendants, former colleagues, even a retired judge who had suspected misconduct for years but never had proof. When it was David's turn to take the stand, he held nothing back. He told the court about the months he spent rotting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, about the hopelessness, the fear, about the moment he thought his life was over, until a dog named Titan changed everything. By the time he stepped down, Winters couldn't even look at him. 2 weeks later, the verdict came in. Guilty. Winters was sentenced to 25 years for prosecutorial misconduct, evidence tampering, and perjury. The system that had nearly destroyed David had finally held someone accountable. As David left the courthouse, A familiar sound met his ears. Titan's bark. The K9 officer was standing near the patrol car, Officer Bradley beside him. Titan's tail wagged as David approached, his tongue hanging lazily out of his mouth. David crouched down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Guess you took down 2 criminals, huh?" Titan huffed as if agreeing. Bradley smiled. "He's retiring soon. The department thinks he's earned it." David's heart clenched. "So what happens to him?" Bradley hesitated. "Well, usually retired K9’s are put up for adoption to officers or special programs, but..." He studied David for a moment. "If you're interested, I could put in a request. After all, I'd say he's more your hero than anyone else's." David looked down at Titan, who was staring at him expectantly. His eyes burned, but he grinned. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think he's coming home with me." A month later, David sat on the porch of his mother's house, watching Titan nap in the afternoon sun. The K9 had adjusted surprisingly well to retirement, though he still had the instincts of a working dog. He rarely let David out of his sight, always alert, always watching. But there was a peace in his eyes now, a contentment that hadn't been there before. David had spent the last few weeks figuring out what his life looked like now. He had gotten a part-time job at a community center, speaking to at-risk youth about the justice system and the importance of knowing your rights. He wasn't a lawyer, but after what he had been through, he felt like he had a duty to help others avoid his fate. One afternoon, James Calloway called with news. "They're starting a legal aid program for people who've been wrongly convicted," James said over the phone. "They want you to be a part of it." David hesitated. "I don't have a law degree." "You don't need one," James replied. "You have experience. You know firsthand what it's like to be caught in the system. You'd be mentoring people, guiding them through the process, making sure they don't get lost like you did." David looked at Titan, who lifted his head slightly, sensing the shift in David's energy. Could he really do this? "Think about it," James said. "You've already done more than most people ever do to fix this broken system. This is just the next step." David sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of reluctance. It was the sigh of a man realizing he had a purpose. "I'm in." A year later, David sat in a different courtroom. This time, he wasn't the defendant. He wasn't even the witness. He was there as an advocate. The young man sitting beside him, Jamal Reed, was just 18 years old. A kid caught in a system that had labeled him a criminal before he even had a chance to defend himself. David saw himself in him. As the judge entered, David placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "We've got this," he whispered. Titan, sitting at David's feet, let out a soft huff, as if in agreement. For the first time in a long time, David felt whole. Justice had saved him. Now, he was going to save others. 6 months later, David sat in a small, cluttered office, stacks of case files piled high around him. The legal aid program had taken off faster than anyone expected. People from all over the state, some from other parts of the country, had reached out, desperate for help. Some were innocent, caught in a web of false accusations. Others were victims of an unjust system that punished poverty more than crime. David had made it his mission to help as many as he could. Titan lay beside his desk, his ears flicking occasionally, his watchful eyes scanning the room. Even in retirement, he remained a guardian. James walked in, tossing a fresh stack of papers onto David's desk. "Another one," David exhaled, rubbing his temples. "That makes 5 this week." "Yep." James leaned against the desk. "But this one feels familiar." David glanced at the file and immediately froze. The name on the page made his stomach churn. Javier Morales, his brother. David hadn't seen Javier in years. Their relationship had been strained long before David's wrongful conviction. Javier had fallen into the wrong crowd, making bad choices, some of them deliberate, some of them out of survival. But now he was sitting in a jail cell, facing charges that could ruin his life. James crossed his arms. "You don't have to take this one." David swallowed hard. "I do." The next day, David walked into the same prison he had once been locked inside. But this time, he wasn't wearing an orange jumpsuit. This time, he was walking in as someone who could make a difference. Javier sat at the table, looking thinner than David remembered, his face hardened by whatever he had been through. "You really came," Javier muttered, staring at him. David pulled out the file, placing it on the table. "Tell me everything." Javier let out a dry laugh. "You think I'm innocent?" David held his gaze. "I think I need to hear it from you." Javier looked away. "I didn't do what they're saying. I swear." David studied him. For the first time in a long time, he believed him. He exhaled and leaned forward. "Then let's get to work." Titan sat beside David, silent but alert. Another case, another fight. David didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Javier exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the cold steel of the table. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting someone to be listening in. But it was just the two of them. Two brothers who hadn't spoken in years, now sitting across from each other in a prison meeting room. David could tell Javier didn't trust him yet, didn't trust anyone. But David knew this system better than most. He knew how easily someone could be swallowed by it, how quickly a case could be twisted, manipulated, fabricated. He had been there, and if Javier was telling the truth, David was his only chance. Titan let out a soft huff beneath the table. His body stretched out lazily, but his eyes locked on Javier. The dog hadn't moved much since they sat down, but David knew Titan was always watching. Javier leaned forward, his voice low. "I didn't do what they're saying, man. I swear." David studied him for a long moment. "What happened?" Javier ran a hand over his face. "I was at the wrong place, wrong time. Some guys I used to know, they robbed a liquor store. I didn't even know they were going to do it. I was just there. But when the cops showed up, guess who they grabbed?" David clenched his jaw. He had heard the story before. How many times had innocent people been swept up in the chaos, blamed for being in the wrong place? But this was different. This was his brother. "Do they have evidence?" David asked. Javier scoffed. "A witness who says they saw me, security footage that's blurry as hell, and some expert claiming I matched the description." He shook his head. "Sound familiar?" "Too familiar." David's hands tightened into fists. He had spent months rotting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. He had promised himself that if he ever got out, he would fight for people who had no one else to fight for them. And now that person was his brother. He took a deep breath. "Okay, we're going to fight this." Javier looked up, his expression unreadable. "Why?" David blinked. "What?" Javier's jaw tightened. "Why help me? We haven't talked in years. And now you're sitting here like you're my lawyer? You don't owe me this." David leaned forward. "You're right. I don't." His voice was steady. "But I know what it's like to sit in a cell for something you didn't do. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Not even you." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Javier's eyes softened. Just slightly. David pushed the case file toward him. "We start now. Tell me everything." Titan lifted his head, as if sensing that something had just shifted. Because it had. David wasn't just saving strangers anymore. He was saving his family, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. David spent the next few days immersed in Javier's case. He pored over police reports, surveillance footage, and witness statements, looking for holes in the prosecution story. And there were plenty. The security footage was grainy at best. It showed 3 masked individuals running out of the liquor store, but none of them were clearly identifiable. The prosecution's key witness was a man with a criminal record who had only come forward after being offered a reduced sentence for an unrelated charge, and the so-called expert testimony? Flimsy at best. This case had Winters' fingerprints all over it. Even though Winters was behind bars, his legacy of rushed prosecutions and ignored evidence was still ruining lives. David clenched his jaw as he flipped through the file again. Javier was being railroaded. Not on his watch. He called James Calloway. "I need your help," David said, his voice firm. "Javier's case is built on bad evidence. It's exactly like mine." James sighed on the other end of the line. "I was afraid of that." All right, let's take it apart piece by piece. I'll pull some strings and see what we can get. David didn't hesitate. And I want Titan on this. There was a pause. Titan. David looked down at the dog resting by his feet. Titan had exposed the truth once before. If anyone could sense something off about this case, it was him. James chuckled. You know, I should probably question that logic. But after what happened in your trial, I'm not going to argue. The next morning, David and Titan walked into the police station, where they had secured a meeting with Detective Mills. He was the lead investigator in Javier's case, a veteran cop who prided himself on his gut instincts. Mills looked skeptical as David laid out everything: the weak evidence, the questionable witness, the unreliable footage. I've seen this before, David said. It happened to me. You've got the wrong guy. Mills exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He tapped a pen against the desk, clearly thinking. Look, he said finally, I don't take wrongful convictions lightly, but I need more than just a hunch. David nodded. Then let Titan take a look at the evidence. Mills raised an eyebrow. You want a dog to review a case file? David smiled. Not the case file. The crime scene footage. The clothing they confiscated from Javier. Let him tell us if something isn't right. Mills hesitated, then shrugged. Fine, but if this is a waste of time, it won't be. Titan didn't hesitate. When they brought out the bag of confiscated clothing, supposedly worn by one of the robbers, Titan sniffed, took a step back, and let out a low growl. Mills' expression changed. David knew that look. Titan had just detected a problem. The detective rubbed his face. Damn it, David crossed his arms. I told you. Now, let's find out who really committed this crime. Detective Mills sat in silence for a long moment, staring at Titan, who remained rigid, his ears perked, his body tense. The K9's reaction wasn't just a fluke. Titan had sensed something was wrong. David could see the shift in Mills' expression. The detective wasn't the kind of man who ignored his instincts, and right now, his gut was telling him the same thing Titan was. Mills let out a slow breath. All right, I need to see everything again. He turned to one of the officers standing nearby. Pull the surveillance footage from the robbery, and get me the evidence logs from that night. I want to know exactly how this case was put together. David exchanged a look with James, who had been standing quietly beside him. They were finally getting somewhere. 20 minutes later, they were seated in front of a monitor as the grainy footage played. The video showed 3 masked individuals sprinting out of the liquor store, their movements frantic. The problem? None of them moved like Javier. David narrowed his eyes. Pause it. Mills hit the spacebar, freezing the image. David pointed at one of the figures. Look at the way he runs. That's not my brother. Mills rubbed his chin. You sure? David turned to James, who flipped through Javier's arrest report. Javier has an old knee injury from a construction job, James said. His right leg locks when he runs. That guy? His stride is clean. No limp. Mills frowned, leaning closer. So if Javier wasn't one of the 3, then why did the witness ID him? James scoffed. Because they were offered a deal to testify. That so-called eyewitness is facing felony charges of their own. Mills cursed under his breath. David folded his arms. You're looking at the wrong guy. Mills didn't argue. He just picked up his radio. Get me a background check on the witness. I want to know exactly what charges they're facing. It took less than an hour for the truth to come out. The witness had a long history of criminal activity. He had been offered a plea deal if he could ID a suspect, so he chose Javier. There was no real evidence. No real case. Just another rushed conviction. Mills ran a hand down his face. This is a mess. David clenched his fists. Yeah. And my brother is sitting in a cell for it. Mills stood up, his voice firm. Not for much longer. 2 days later, Javier stood in front of the judge as the prosecution dropped all charges. David sat in the front row, Titan beside him, watching as his brother finally walked free. The weight of what had almost happened wasn't lost on him. Javier had nearly become another statistic, another innocent man swallowed by a broken system. But not this time. Not with David fighting for him. Outside the courthouse, Javier exhaled sharply, rubbing his wrists as if still expecting to feel cuffs around them. That was too close, man. David studied him. You okay? Javier hesitated. Then, for the first time in years, he met David's gaze with something real. Something vulnerable. I don't know, he admitted. But I know I don't want to go back. David nodded. Then don't. Javier let out a dry laugh. Easier said than done. David pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. I got you a meeting at the Legal Aid Center. If you want to get your record cleaned up, they can help. Javier stared at him. You're serious? David shrugged. You're my brother. A long pause. Then Javier nodded. Okay. Titan let out a soft huff, his tail thumping against the ground. For the first time, David felt like maybe, just maybe, his family had a second chance. 6 months later, David sat in the back of a crowded courtroom, watching someone else fight for their freedom. This time, it wasn't him. It wasn't his brother. It was someone he was defending. Javier sat beside him, dressed in clean, professional clothes, a far cry from the worn-out hoodie he had been wearing the day David found him in that prison meeting room. He had stayed out of trouble, kept his head down, and, to David's surprise, started working at the same legal aid center that had helped him. When Javier had first walked through those doors, it was to get his own record cleaned up. But something changed along the way. He started listening, started seeing how many other people had been trapped in the same cycle he had. And one day, he told David, I think I want to help. So now, here they were, watching a young man, a teenager who reminded them both of their younger selves, waiting for a judge to decide if his life would be ruined by a system that didn't see him as a person, but as a case file. Titan sat at their feet, his ears twitching, still alert even after months of peaceful retirement. He had settled into life as David's shadow, always watching, always guarding. And somehow, despite everything, he had also become Javier's shadow, too. The judge finally spoke. After reviewing the new evidence and testimony, the court finds the defendant not guilty. Case dismissed. The relief in the room was instant. The young man's mother broke down in tears. The public defender let out a breath they had clearly been holding, and for a moment, hope felt real. Javier leaned toward David, his voice low. That was close. David nodded. Too close. As they stood to leave, Javier hesitated. You ever think about how different things could have been if Titan hadn't spoken up that day in your trial? David exhaled. Every damn day, they walked outside, the sun warm on their faces, Titan trotting beside them like he had always been part of their story. David glanced at his brother. You did good in there. Javier shrugged. You too. Then, after a pause, think they'll ever let me argue a case? David laughed. Let's start with law school first. Javier smirked. Yeah. One step at a time, Titan let out a soft woof as if agreeing. And as they walked toward the future, one neither of them had ever imagined, they knew one thing for sure. Justice had almost failed them. But now, they were making sure it never failed anyone else. 1 year later, David stood at the front of a packed auditorium, looking out at a sea of faces. Some were young law students eager to change the system. Others were exonerees, people who had been through what he had survived. And some were officers, the ones who actually cared about getting it right. Titan sat beside him, his medal of valor gleaming under the stage lights. Even in retirement, he was a symbol. David adjusted the microphone. He had given a lot of speeches over the past year, but this one felt different. This one was personal. He took a deep breath. A little over a year ago, I was sitting in a courtroom, waiting for a judge to decide my fate. I was innocent, but that didn't matter. The system doesn't always care about truth. It cares about winning. The room was silent. David continued, his voice steady. I was days away from losing everything. And the only reason I'm standing here today is because someone finally listened. But not a person, not a lawyer, not even a judge, a dog. A few people chuckled softly, but the weight of his words hung in the air. Titan knew I was innocent before anyone else did. He knew because the truth was there, It was always there. People just refused to see it. David looked across the room. That's why we're here today, to talk about what happens when people stop ignoring the truth. When we stop treating convictions like trophies and start treating them like the life-altering decisions they are. He glanced down at Titan, who sat calm, watchful, forever loyal. If a K9 can recognize injustice, then so can we. The question is, will we do something about it? The applause was thunderous. As David stepped off the stage, Javier was waiting for him, dressed sharper than David had ever seen him. "You're getting good at this," Javier said, smirking. David shrugged. "Guess I've had practice." Javier held up a letter, waving it slightly. "I got in." David's breath caught. "Law school?" Javier nodded, pride flickering in his eyes. "Yeah. Guess I figured if my brother could pull off the impossible, so can I." David smiled. "You're gonna change the world, man." Javier chuckled. "Nah, I think we already are." Titan let out a satisfied woof. And as the three of them walked out into the city, under a sky that felt just a little brighter, David knew it was true. Justice had almost failed them. But now, they were making sure it never failed anyone else.